What is this? Is this a crystal ball, or is this the future? Welcome back, friends. Today I'm continuing my series on history, and I'm going to be considering in particular whether texts like the Bible or mythological texts can be considered history, and why or why not. Now, usually when we pose this question with regard to mythological texts or the Bible, this translates to, should we believe that these people were backwards and ignorant, or should we believe that they were highly sophisticated and literary? Did they intend their texts to be taken literally, or did they intend them to be taken figuratively? Where literal is equivalent to them being so infantile that they couldn't make heads nor tails of reality, and figurative is equivalent to them being sufficiently complex and intelligent to actually provide layers of meaning to their texts. We forget the third possibility, namely that we ourselves are ignorant and backwards precisely to the extent that we are so highly sophisticated and literary. We come at these texts with a very definite prejudice, namely the bias that the words literal and figurative mean two contrary things, that these are two mutually exclusive categories. But are they? Are they really? And as a corollary to this, we believe that we have to approach these texts either from the literal point of view or from the figurative point of view. We have to understand whether any given passage in these texts is to be interpreted literally or figuratively. But is it? Is it really? Okay, so first of all, let's come to terms with a few, well, terms. What is a literal reading of a text? What does it mean to read a text literally? Well, if we say a passage is literal, we mean that it means what it means. But what does that mean? Well, let's go straight for the jugular on this one. Let's talk about a text which is perhaps the most hotly debated of all of our literature when it comes to the question of whether we should be reading it figuratively or literally. I'm talking, of course, of the famous passages in Genesis 1 over which people waste so, well, that is to say, over which people spend so much of their lives arguing. Now, in the very opening lines of the Bible, we are told that God made the heavens and the earth, and that he did all of this in just the space of 6 days. From which the question naturally arises, what does the text mean when it says day? Does it literally mean 24-hour periods? Literally? Now, some commentators, even today, will say that it does mean this, and they will do so, despite the fact that on the first day there was manifestly no way of even measuring a day. No sun, no moon, no earth, no sky. There wasn't even any being to experience time, apart from God, who, of course, is transcendent with respect to time. So what are we even talking about here? Well, they will respond, we are talking about standard units of time that one can somehow cut up and measure somehow. You know, like time were a stick of butter and you could just cut it into pieces. Okay, so let's just suppose literal 24-hour periods of time. 24 hours precisely or not quite? Because a day, as we understand it, isn't exactly 24 hours now, is it? It actually varies a bit from day to day, depending as well on how you measure it, whether, say, by the sun or by the stars, none of which, again, existed at the very beginning, but we'll set that aside. So maybe these original days were literally precisely 24-hour periods of time, while our days are less than 24 hours. Maybe these biblical days were more literally days than our days are. Or perhaps we mean to say that the days of Genesis are literally precisely those imprecise measures of time that we ourselves mean when we speak of a day. That's literally what we're talking about. Or we might say that the Bible is telling us that God literally made the heavens of the earth in 6 spans of literally more or less 24 hours. 24 hours, give or take a few minutes. 4 minutes to be precise, more or less. Now, some literalist interpreter out there is bound to say that all of this is beside the point. The point is not to scientifically and precisely measure the precise number of minutes in a day, but just to define a day as we humanly define days and to go with that. And good, we agree. But again, how do you humanly define a day without the sun, the moon, sun up, sundown, the earth, the sky, clocks, hourglasses, or sundials? How do you humanly define the day without human beings? What kind of sense could any of this possibly make? So much for the literalist interpretation. The figurative reading, on the other hand, is that day is just a stand-in here for some undefined length of time, which could last anywhere from a single instantaneous moment all the way up to several thousand billion years. Good, strong, clear positions, both of them. The conflict here does at least point us to the interesting fact that time is inherently and necessarily subjective. You cannot detach time from the experience of time. And anyone and everyone can attest to this who has ever found the flow of time interrupted or warped or distorted somehow, or even altered completely beyond recognition by some great life event, by loss or by love. Now, either side of this debate runs into inevitable and insurmountable difficulties. Those who insist on reading the Bible strictly literally will occasionally have to admit that the Bible does use poetic language. That is to say, language which must be taken figuratively if you're going to make any sense of it at all. When Jesus, for example, says that his disciples are the salt of the earth, well, I think we can all probably agree that he wasn't saying. So how do you make the determination about when the Bible uses poetic language and when it speaks literally? You just know. Similarly, even those who want to read the Bible in the most figurative way possible will have to admit that every now and then it is talking about real concrete things. It is using literal language. At least some of the individual human beings in it, for instance, are really human beings. They are not stand-ins for something else. To take just one of the most obvious cases, King Nebuchadnezzar is really King Nebuchadnezzar. He is not just a figure of speech standing in, say, for tyrannical monarchical authority. So again, the question emerges. How do you decide which language is supposed to be figurative and which language is supposed to be literal? Well, you can feel it, man. You just feel it. And this is the real problem. Both of these positions are reduced in the last analysis to deciding things based on one's personal biases or on the basis of one's feelings. Not a great philological standard. So what can we do about this? Well, the obvious solution is just to take all of this literature, the Bible and all of the fables and all of that, and just throw these books out. That was not a Bible. I would not throw a Bible. Just take everything that smacks of mythology and get rid of it. All the old fables, gibberish, can't be worked with, don't make a jot of sense. Let's just get rid of all this past junk and focus on the real stuff, what we've got today. Scientific literature. Now here we can at last reason. Straightforward, clear, strictly literal, no questions about it. Okay, so maybe mostly literal? And mythological, on the other hand, is entirely figurative. Setting aside the Bible, which is kind of a complicated case, if you look at mythological literature, we're talking about strictly figurative work here. Pandora with her box. We're not literally talking about a woman. We're not literally talking about a box. We're not literally talking about hope. So maybe we can say that it's mostly figurative. Mythological texts are mostly figurative. Scientific texts are mostly literal. Modern history, definitely mostly literal. Biblical history, well, it's complicated. All right, so let's step back for a moment. Let's collect ourselves. What does literal actually mean? When we use this word, what do we mean by it? Well, literally, the word literal refers to the letters of the text. So a literal reading would be focused on the letters of the text? Clearly not. The plot thickens. The word literal is actually a figurative word. Now, this is philosophical irony at its finest, and I actually think that a great deal could be made of it. But I'll resist the temptation of lingering on this point. Let's move on. When we use the word literal, we mean that a text should be taken at face value. There's no second meaning overlaying the words. There's no hidden agenda. There's no use of one thing to stand in for another thing. The words are to be considered direct references to the things of which they're speaking. So when we say that a given historical passage is meant literally, we mean that these things actually really happened the way that this passage says they did. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if you had been there, then you would have seen it with your own eyes, exactly the way it's described. So I've discussed this and some of the problems with this view in my prior videos on history, but let's talk about it again. I actually do think that this is a point worth dwelling on. A question for you. On the basis of what criteria can you be sure that you would have seen precisely what is being described in a given passage? On the basis of what criteria can you be sure that you would have seen precisely what another person claims to have seen in a given moment? Consider a famous historical event, one of those things that most of us learn in school. Julius Caesar, when crossing the Rubicon, is said to have uttered the words, "The die is cast." Jacta alea est. And we know this because it's recounted both by Plutarch and by Suetonius. So we can say with some degree of confidence that this actually happened. This was a real historical event. The text is meant literally, and we can take it as being a description of past events. Caesar did utter these words, except that Plutarch and Suetonius write in two different languages and use different grammatical structures. For Suetonius, the expression is "the die is cast," whereas for Plutarch, it's more like "let the die be cast." And it might have been "alea jacta est" that Caesar said, which has for some reason become the standard word order for this citation. Or maybe it was "jacta alea esto," meaning "let the die be cast." Or, since Julius Caesar was evidently citing the Greek poet Menander, perhaps he actually spoke these words in the ancient Greek. "Anerifto kubos." But in any case, we're more or less there. This is more or less literally what happened. Caesar literally said something about a die and literally talked about it being thrown in some way. If you had been there, you would have heard something like these words uttered by his lips. That sound would have transferred itself from his mouth through the air and into your eardrums. Literal. Put otherwise, this is not just some anecdote invented after the fact to ornament the episode. And it's not just a poetic expression which tries to point to some fundamental thing about the meaning of this moment historically. The two historians who talk about this mean to tell us that this thing actually really happened. And we know that these two historians meant this because, well, okay, so we can't know what the authors actually intended, and we can't know if it really happened this way. But it's the least complicated way of interpreting these passages, and we consider it to be plausible, so we're willing to just accept it and not ask any further questions. So already here we are incubating half a dozen assumptions that we have no right to make. These assumptions grow still more evident when we consider texts which we would consider to be less plausible. Homer is an excellent example of this. So if we set aside for a moment all those interpreters who think that Homer was just infantile and incapable of thinking, we're confronted with the problem of how exactly to interpret these fantastic stories that we find in his books. To take one of the most trivial examples of this, when Homer says, for instance, that the divinity, the god Ares, came down and fought in battle side by side with the Trojans, we want to take this to be either poetic or figurative language. And why? Well, because we've never known a god to just come down into the fray of war and start taking people out, so and since we've never seen such a thing, we are content to think that it never could have happened. We are even content to think that no rational, intelligent man would ever consider it as a possibility. But here's the difficulty. The one real primary source that we have about the Trojan War tells us that this did happen. We are assuming that that poet intended this to be poetic or figurative language on the grounds of our experience and our understanding of the world, not on the grounds of the poet's experience or his understanding of the world. We are importing our own contemporary scientific worldview into the text. Indeed, we are deporting ourselves much less like the historian, the mere accumulator of facts, and far more like the histor, the judge of past possibilities. But this altogether reframes our notion of history, and it makes it necessary for us to ask questions that historians don't commonly ask themselves. Philosophical and theological questions about the nature and structure of reality, about the limits of possibility. See, we talk about figurative and literal interpretations of the text, but the fact of the matter is that we ourselves are deciding what texts, what passages should be read literally, when, and how. And we are doing so on the basis of a pre-established canon, which actually transcends these texts completely and encompasses them. If we do not understand that canon, the canon from which we are working, then we are acting blindly and arbitrarily. We are moving in a radically unhistorical way. The plain fact of the matter is there is no such thing as a literal reading of a text, save as we ourselves invent and insist upon it. That should be highly disorienting, and we should be taking this very seriously. On the other hand, we have this other expression, figurative. So what does that mean? What is a figurative reading of a text? Well, it means that the text doesn't mean what it seems to mean. The text means some other thing. And of course the question is, well, how do you decide what that other thing is, or when you should be interpreting a text figuratively at all? We talk a lot about symbols in this regard, but what is a symbol? We take a symbol to mean one thing which stands in for another thing. The crystal ball is a symbol for prophecy. It is not prophecy itself. This is such a paltry crystal ball. Look, I don't have props for any of this. I'm just making things up as I go along. Give me a break. Now, this is an interesting notion of the symbol because it suggests that one thing is taking the place of another. But the word symbol actually means something different. Symbolon from the Greek, which means the two things are actually thrown together with one another. A throwing together with. The word symbol doesn't indicate a substitution. It indicates a joining, a uniting, a combination of two different things, or a fusing of these two things into a single entity or single reality. And this gets to something fundamental, not only about our way of reading texts, but also our way of experiencing the world as human beings. Without the substrate of reality, something concrete and real that you can get your hands on or experience in some way, the symbol is just a floating marker signifying absolutely nothing. And on the other hand, these mere objects that surround us, if they don't have some superstrate of symbol overlain upon them, are dead and meaningless. The two things, the concrete and the symbolic, the literal and the figurative, have to join together. They complete one another. The whole of the life of the human being is permeated with this necessity. All of our highest moments are the joining of fact and symbol. Artistic creation in its highest sense is redolent with this. All of art represents the joining of these two different aspects. All of good art, I should say. This is part of what makes so much of contemporary art so intolerable. It divides these things in any number of different ways. But scientific epiphany is also like this. I mean, if you think of Newton being struck on the head with an apple, or Archimedes' epiphany as he was in the bath, right? I mean, his very exclamation, Eureka, I have seen. He's talking about an epiphany, a joining together of these two different realms. And this happens to us all as well in moments of tremendous fortune or misfortune. When we experience a sudden windfall, it's like the heavens have opened up and something has just been bestowed upon us. When we lose a loved one, when somebody dies in our life, it's as if the veil is rent for a moment and you are set before the reality of your situation as a human being. You can no longer deny all of the meaning which stands behind these mere appearances. And similarly, and perhaps above all, when you fall in love with another human being, symbol and reality come together, they fuse, they merge, and this gap in our human hearts is closed. And a sense of completion and rightness comes upon you, such as you've never felt in all your life. In moments like this, you are no longer living in the literal world, and you're no longer living in a figurative world. You are living in the human world, the complete world, the true world. Now, those moments of honesty can be devastating. They reveal the paltriness of everything else. They show us how everything in our lives which lacks that shine of transcendence is in some way mendacious or inadequate or hollow or dead. And this is not to say that the commonplace things of our lives, our day to day routines or our quotidian events and happenings, are trivial or in some way empty. These things are fundamentally meaningful. They go to making up our lives. They're beautiful in and of themselves, but only if they are infused with the glow of a greater meaning. A human life which attempts to rest exclusively on that plane of the workaday and the commonplace will inevitably collapse into triviality and despair, into what we call nihilism. But true nihilism is impossible to the human being. Asking a man to live without meaning is equivalent to asking him to live without breath. The human being will invent meaning where he finds none. That is how deep the need in him goes. What we commonly call nihilism is actually nothing more than that life of quiet despair which was so beautifully described and diagnosed by Thoreau. It is, in truth, a state of hopelessness. And history, insofar as it would describe the past without any reference to meaning, is nihilistic in this basic sense. It is an act of despair, of a desperate time. And in consequence to this, we can also say that the most perfect history is that history which most perfectly represents the meaning of a past time to our eyes. The true realm of history is not fact, but meaning. It is that transcendent realm in which the figurative and the literal unite into a single thing. That shows us the true dimension of the historical times and epics to which we give our attention. That and that alone. So let's return. Can we consider the Bible or mythology to be works of history? Well, what is history? Is it what really happened? Tell me, what really happens in moments of transcendence? What really happens in moments of death or love or tragedy or transfiguration? What really happens when your soul connects to another human soul? If history means what we tend to think that it means, just this accumulation of facts that really happened, then history as we understand it is just an empty husk. It is a meaningless shell, and perhaps not even so much as that. But in truth, we should be reworking our sense of history, because what really happened is entirely other than what we take it for. In point of fact, symbolic histories are truer than merely factual histories. Myth and legend are truer than literal historical readings. Put otherwise, as I say in the preface to my up-and-coming book on Robin Hood, Man of Locksley, history is but a skin worn by prehistory. Now, it's needless to say that all of this has a great many ramifications for our view of history. Some of those ramifications are more evident than others. If we were to take this really seriously, we would have to completely rework our sense of history. The question presents itself almost unbidden. What would history look like if we began to understand it as this fusing, this melding of the symbolic and the factual, of the literal and the figurative? Would it look exactly like our contemporary history? Seems doubtful. Would it look exactly like some past form of history? Perhaps one of the forms of history that we've so briefly discussed here, the history of Herodotus, or the history of Thucydides, the history of the great Latin Roman historians. Would it look like mythology? Would it look like the Bible? The Bible is certainly one of the texts which most perfectly fuses these two dimensions into one. It is rife with this combination. Consider, just as an example, the episode of Jesus Christ walking on the water. That means both that Jesus Christ literally walked on the water that day, but it also has this just incredible richness underneath it. We're talking about Jesus Christ walking over the surface of something that is ungovernable and formless, of making solid that which is absolutely insolid. of commanding and governing the chaos which is represented by the sea. It shows Christ as a miracle worker in a very physical and literal sense, but it also shows him as the master of the cosmos, the one being, the one entity who is capable of governing all of the parts and putting them to order. And this is just one example of the way in which the Bible presents these moments in which the division, the distinction between the literal and the figurative is completely broken down. It completely disappears. And the result of that is something sacred and divine. That's part of the power of this text. It represents to us precisely what I was talking about before, those moments in our lives in which we see that division being broken down, in which we feel and experience these two things joining together. And in my opinion, we all need to be striving to recapture this to some extent in our way of viewing the past. We need to try to transcend our completely inadequate view of history, and to ask ourselves finally what history looks like if we reintroduce the element of meaning into it. That element has always been present. You can't get rid of that element of meaning in history. The idea of an objective or a scientific history is just fundamentally nonsensical, supposing by objective and scientific we mean impartial and neutral. The very act of excavating history from the centuries in which it's been buried is an act of choosing, selection, deciding what is important and what is not important. It is an act of meaning seeking and meaning making. So I'll leave you with that question. What would history look like if we brought this dimension back into it? Would our contemporary histories look anything like they do now, if we really took all of this seriously? If we could break out of our own fundamental limitations and prejudices and for a moment see the world beyond the lens, the very narrow lens of our scientistic thinking, what would the consequences of that be for our lives and for our way of viewing the past and for our way of viewing the present as well? So, I might make another video about all of this in which I return to our contemporary history in light of everything that we've said before, or I might just leave things lie precisely where they have fallen, with a number of open questions that are probably unanswerable. We shall see. How's that for a cliffhanger? Now you're really wondering, right? Is John going to continue his series on history with a fourth video, or isn't he? Thrilling. Okay. Anyway, if, as seems increasingly improbable, you have actually managed to reach this late point in my third installment on history, then I want to thank you very sincerely for having joined me this far. I greatly appreciate it. Leave me your views below on the relationship of history and myth, any ideas that you have along these lines, what you think of the Bible and all of this. If you liked this video, then like this video, and if you disliked this video, then dislike it. Carry on. Carry on with what you're doing. Just carry on. If you have not subscribed to my channel and you would like more miscellaneous thoughts from me about a miscellany of subjects, then please, by all means, subscribe. Now, speaking of history, I've lately been in a very curious relationship to time and myself. The natural flow of time has been fundamentally altered for me. I am presently recording a video which will be published at some point in the future, and it is entirely possible that by the time I publish this video, I will have already published my novel, Man of Locksley. Otherwise, Man of Locksley should be coming soon. So depending on where this video falls and where you find yourself in the flow of time, if you look down into the description of this video, you may or may not find a link to that book. You will, however, I can almost guarantee it, find a link to my ongoing serial publication of my novel, Sacrifice, a Western, about the discovery of a mine and the consequences thereof. Gold mine, needless to say. You'll also find links to my other social media. Join me, follow me, let's go. All right, friends, thanks again so much for coming with me on this curious journey. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about all this, and until next time, farewell.
No, 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 no.